Hello and welcome to another episode of the ID Talk podcast. I'm Tony Bidzionis and I'm here with my very good friend, Alex Perala. Alex, hello, how are you?
Hello, Tony. I'm fine. Thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Um, we had a really great talk with Jake Parker and Ron Hawkins from SIA. That's coming up a little bit later in the show. We talked about their recently released Security Market Index for September and October 2024. And it was a really interesting conversation. It went in a few different directions and we learned quite a bit as always. But Alex, before we get to that, is there anything that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, one thing caught my eye in particular this past week, which was Meta bringing back facial recognition.
Mhm.
So this is a story about how Facebook's owner basically is reactivating facial recognition after disabling it in 2021. And it just really struck me because I think it really reflects the culture around this kind of technology and I guess more broadly. So when you look back to 2021, when Meta just like announced to everyone that they were going to disable facial recognition, that was at a time when I think that I would say that was maybe the height of scrutiny from the public, and by that I mean mainly like civil rights groups, over facial recognition. And of course, that was like right after a time of a lot of protest in the US and in the world and concern about how police might use facial recognition. So Facebook announced that it was disabling it. And what that really meant was like, you can't tag people anymore in photos, basically. Um, so it would get a little less convenient for most people. And then it would get a lot less convenient for people who are visually impaired and relied on this assistive technology that would explain what's happening in photos to them and could actually tell them the names of people in photos, which no longer was going to work because that requires facial recognition. So that happened. A couple years went by, and here we are, and everyone's worried about deepfake scams, and they're worried that people are gonna give their information to who they think is Mr. Beast because they want a free iPhone, and it turns out it's just a deepfake generated thing, and so in order to fight deepfake scams, Meta's like, we're bringing back facial recognition so that we can see when like a fake celebrity is running some kind of scam on our platforms. So, and I haven't seen like a lot of pushback so far. Like it seems like this is just sort of, I don't know, whoever noticed that this is happening has just kind of shrugged and moved on with their lives. So um, I think just times have changed is what I'm really getting at here. Times have changed.
Yeah, quite quickly too.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And I do remember like we did a few pieces about I think it was a BIPA settlement against Meta, or that Meta settled for the use of tagging in, was it Facebook or was it Instagram or was it both?
Probably both. I don't know. I assume there have been multiple lawsuits
Yeah,
against both platforms for the same thing.
yeah. And then to see it come do a 180 and just come right back a couple years later is not that big of a surprise. I mean, we've talked a lot about the election coming up and how much of an impact that's had on a lot of the fears around deepfakes.
Mhm.
Um, just the rapid evolution of AI, it's bound to bring change like this, and it kind
Yeah.
of uh, fits in well with what I wanted to talk about this week, which was a recent study that came out of IE University in Madrid that reported 3/4 of those surveyed Europeans. They surveyed 3,000 Europeans across 10 countries. 3/4 support the use of AI in policing and military, which kind of surprised me when I read that. just because for exactly what we were just talking about.
It's one of
Um,
those things as an editor, I almost wrote like in the headline, I was going to be like surprising results. And then I'm like, nah, well, that's kind of that's a value judgment, but yeah, it is surprising.
yeah, I honestly don't think any of our readers would not be surprised by,
Yeah.
I mean, unless you were directly involved in that study, but or you were one of the 3,000 people who was surveyed. Um, but it also, I mean, other some of the other findings from the study sort of paint the picture a little clearer, because 79% of respondents said that they also support the use of AI in other areas, things like traffic optimization. So less immediately threatening than the police or the military using it.
Mhm.
And the on the other side of the coin, 67% said that they're concerned about the use of AI for things like interfering with democratic processes. So I guess all of that does kind of make sense if you look at it that way. It's not that everybody's just accepting that AI is here to stay, and whether it is or it isn't, it depends on the use cases. There was an interesting story this week, I think, pretty big story about North Korean soldiers, like 15,000 North Korean soldiers spotted in Russia training with the Russian army.
Mhm.
And I remember reading about that like a week ago or so. And then we reported this week that it was confirmed using facial recognition, which surprised me a little bit that there's facial recognition files on North Korean soldiers, but
Yeah.
you know,
One thing going back to that study um, that you mentioned from Madrid, one thing that really jumped out at me, and I almost made this the headline, was 31% of Europeans believe AI has already influenced their voting decisions. That's just, I wonder how they worded that question. I didn't dig in deep enough, but
yeah,
this is a nice segue because I have a horrible illness that I try to conceal, which is that I'm very interested in politics.
you you don't try that hard.
And I was glad when we talked to the SIA or SIA guys that we could get into that a little bit, just because it
Yeah,
is so fascinating and it's part of their market, their survey of industry professionals touched on what's going on with the election and that's not the main thing we talk about, but it was one of the most interesting things that came up during the discussion. And I'll just add that I really like those guys.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Ron and Jake, very smart, serious people, and I got a lot out of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we brought up the conversation sort of went into the election fairly early on, as our listeners are about to hear. And I was sort of I assumed that that would be the end of it. I didn't know how deep into that we'd want to get, but I was happy to see that we didn't just drop it there, that we did refer back to it later on. And that was because they were giving clear and intelligent answers to your clear and intelligent questions. So
Stop.
all right, that's okay. I won't do that again. All right. Well, should we just get to it then?
Let's get to it.
Okay. And today we're joined by Ron Hawkins and Jake Parker from the SIA, the Security Industry Association. Ron and Jake, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony. Great to be here.
And just going to start off before we get into anything, if you guys don't mind, just introduce yourselves and just let our listeners know what you do at the SIA, and we'll take it from there. Ron, why don't we start with you?
Sure. My name's Ron Hawkins. I am Director of Industry Relations here at the Security Industry Association. I've been here for almost 16 years, and oversee a few different projects. The main one we'll be talking about today is our Security Market Index, which is a survey that we conduct every other month to gauge confidence in the security industry.
Sounds good. Jake?
So I lead our government relations efforts at SIA, which basically involves three areas. Number one, advocacy, so federal, state, local levels, advocating for um, policies that help our members, but also their customers, in successfully leveraging security solutions. And also, we have a number of resources we produce for members that talk about policy developments, what it means for the industry, and then a number of events that connect industry with government decision makers, but also those in the government sector as far as security and users.
Awesome. Like Alex mentioned before we started recording, we've been reporting on CF for a long time. So this is kind of cool to meet two. It's like meeting celebrities, meet two people who actually work there. The bar isn't that high, so don't worry. But just to get started, Ron, you mentioned the Security Market Index. I don't know who wants to take this, but can you guys just give us a few key takeaways from the 2024 September-October index that we were just mentioning?
Yeah, be happy to. So, as I mentioned, just to recap, we do this every other month. So 6 times a year, we're able to track sentiment in the industry, and we have a few questions that we ask each time, and we use the results of those questions to come up with what we call our security market index. So that's kind of a proprietary formula, and the number itself only has meaning within the context of these questions. So I have to preface it by with all that information. So basically, a number above 50 indicates growth in the industry. A number below 50 indicates contraction in the industry. So for the past year, it's been hovering typically a little bit above 50, but a couple of months ago, it dipped down to 48. This time around, September, October, it went up to 55. So that was a 7-point jump. And that was actually the biggest jump that we've seen in more than a year. So some pretty strong sentiments for the industry. And some other numbers that are a little more straightforward in their interpretation. We also ask how respondents would characterize business conditions at their company right now. And that's on the typical 5-point scale. Poor, fair, average, good, excellent. So this time around, we had more than 7 out of 10 say either good or excellent. So more than 70% have positive feelings about the way things are going at their company. That included 28% saying excellent, 43% saying good. So and most of the remainder said average. So very small number saying either fair or poor. And I won't dig much deeper into the numbers that formulated the index, but I did want to mention one other question that we asked, and that is we thought it'd be interesting to ask people what they think about the election.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously very divisive, very evenly divided. People have strong opinions, and in that context, we thought these results were kind of interesting. We asked them, what outcome on election day 2024 do you think would be best for your business? So not necessarily asking them what candidate they support, but asking them what candidate they think would be best for their business. And the numbers came out to 32% said a Donald Trump victory, 18% said a Kamala Harris victory. Almost half, 49%, said either they don't know or it won't make a big difference either way. So I thought that was kind of an interesting result, given the intensity of this campaign.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect there to be so many people who are like so on the fence, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
I know Alex and I are in Canada, so it might seem like we're just peeking in through a window and watching things happen, but it's just impossible to ignore. And like you said, it's very divisive. So that is a little bit of a surprising takeaway. Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a bit more in a bit, but I do, or maybe now, depending on your answer to my next question, which is like just going back to the big jump you saw in sentiment. How how do you explain that? It like I'm guessing it's not people feel great about the election. It's not something I hear very much, but maybe it is. If it's like somehow it is political and that's why people are optimistic, that would be an interesting answer. But like in general, what's your analysis? What do you think is accounts for that?
Yeah, so it's challenging to say because we try to keep the survey reasonably short in order to encourage people to actually fill it out.
Mhm.
Um, so it's only 9 or 10 questions that we ask every time around. We do give people the option to add comments if they wish. So when we dig into the analysis a little bit, a lot of times we're relying on those comments that are voluntarily given. You know, we'd love to have everybody who responds to the survey write comments, but they don't do that. So having prefaced my answer with all of that disclaimer, I will say one, the security industry tends to do pretty well. You know, it's often been characterized as recession proof or at least recession resistant. You know, certainly not in a recession, but there have been challenges over the past couple of years with inflation, et cetera. So I think that has something to do with it. One of the measures that I mentioned earlier in terms of the how do you characterize the business conditions at your company? Typically, the good, excellent combination comes in around 70 to 75%. That's not uncommon. If you were to track that over the past several indexes, it would be at about that level. As for how it went from the index itself, how it went from 48 to 55, that's a little more challenging to dig into. Um, and this survey was actually conducted before the Federal Reserve announced its interest rate cut. So we can't point to that. Possibly we could say that obviously there had been a strong anticipation, if not a certainty, that the Fed was going to cut rates by at least a quarter point. A half point was a bit of a surprise. That might have contributed to it. And it, maybe there's also some anticipation that once we get past the election, that things will be a little more settled down. So that maybe Q4, but if you look back 4 years, that certainly wasn't the case. So it's a little hard to say, and I don't want to go out on a limb too far.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess like adding to that, inflation has been coming down over the last several months, so
It has, yeah.
that could be a factor too.
Yeah, that's
But
a great point. It's not 9.1% like it was a couple of years ago. It's down to about 2.5. So yeah, that's definitely been an area of improvement.
so then like going to the political side of things, and I wonder if maybe Jake could have some perspective here, because it sounds, Jake, like you are kind of involved in the conversation facing the government. So like from that perspective, would you say that once the election is over, businesses can anticipate more like stability in how they interact with government, or is it not really a factor?
Yeah, I mean, I think like kind of like Ron was saying, I don't know if a lot of folks in the industry see the outcome as really affecting day to day, businesses one differently one way or another. I know that, I mean, for those companies doing business with the government, the federal budget approval process has been really broken for a number of years. But to the extent that is usually going to be uh, those deals are going to be made, after the election. So that should bring some more stability, maybe fix issues where there's been delays because we're not sure what the final amount of funding is going to be for projects or overall agency appropriations, things like that. But I guess I will say that I think this is one of the most interesting. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time and working in the DC area for about 20 years, but I've been watching the election every time, right? But this is particularly interesting because the outcome really could go any which of several directions, which is pretty unusual. Usually, you kind of know how it's going to be, maybe for Congress or for one house of Congress, and then the White House is up in the air, or vice versa. This time, we could have either party in control of the White House, Senate, or House in any combination. So that has different implications depending on what it is. But there's a couple of things we know they're going to need to happen regardless. And I think the real big one is tax policy. So U.S. tax policy is on a course that will need to be basically extended or reconfigured before the end of 2025. Regardless, it has to be done. And so what changes are made are going to depend on who's in control. And so I think that's probably explains the part of the survey respondents there, where you've got a little bit more positive outlook towards a Trump victory, assuming that means Republicans might control one or both houses of Congress. You're going to have things like potentially corporate tax reductions, or an extension, a revival of the research and development tax credit, which is important to large companies, but also small startups. And we have an increasing number of those entering the security space. So that's going to have to happen, whoever's in charge. So will be probably a big area of focus for us looking at in 25.
That's interesting.
And Alex, if I could just add on to something that Jake mentioned about the budget. So as I mentioned, we do ask our respondents to the survey if they'd like to add some comments, and several of the comments that we received all related to the federal budget, mainly expressing frustration with the budgetary process in Congress. And for example, I'll just quickly read a couple of here. Due to the lack of a U.S. government budget, many of our initiatives are on hold. Constantly dealing with continuing resolutions, CRs, affects our short and long-term forecast for R&D, sales, and production. And that was somebody in the actually in the access control and identity management sector who said that. And somebody else from AI-based video analytics said federal government spending has been slow to move given budget and political uncertainties. State and local has been soft, but all that seems to be loosening up, and Q4 promises to be a good one. So maybe that goes back to, if the budget process can finally get evened out, then things will look a little better, a little more predictable. But there's definitely, and those weren't the only ones, but there definitely is some frustration with the process.
Yeah. So can you guys, either one of you or both, elaborate on what the problem is with, like, I think Jake said the budget process was broken. Like, what do you mean by that? Keeping in mind you're speaking to a couple of Canadians and
Yeah. So basically there's only a few, the margins are so close in the House and Senate between the parties. It makes it really difficult to reach agreement on things because it only takes a few or maybe even one member on either side to slow things down or prevent an agreement. So instead of reaching agreement on like the normal process of passing bills that cover a certain number of agencies, there's supposed to be 12 every year. Instead of actually going through that process, there's basically been an agreement struck on kind of the budget as a whole. At times which has been very difficult to do. It has to happen or else the government shuts down. So there's been a combination of that, and then continuing resolutions basically just says we're going to keep spending at the current rate until we come back to it. And so that's what we're in now until December 20th. And so that has happened quite often, but also it's because it's hard to reach agreement on major changes to the programs. So that's under that, in a continuing resolution situation, I know agencies are more constrained in what they can do as far as new projects. So it's definitely what I think those folks were talking about that Ron referenced.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that situation probably doesn't change a whole lot because of whatever the outcome is going to be, it's still going to be pretty close margins in both the House and Senate. So
yeah, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the unpredictability of the outcome of the election, like it sounds to me like the unlikelihood of a resounding victory for either side implies to me just more like deadlock in Congress, because it's just, two sides that are dug in, and it's like trench warfare at that point. It's like, a few yards at a time.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Like, so one example would be what the impact might be is a continuation of the current situation where you're not going to have a consensus on sweeping national legislation on data privacy, for example. I mean, I don't see that changing unless Democrats, I guess, maybe sweep White House, House and Senate, that becomes more possible.
Mhm.
Not doesn't guarantee anything, but it's absent that, I think we're still in a situation where the sides can't come to an agreement on it. So you're going to see more action on data privacy probably at the state level, like we've seen this past year. And then, but in the same thing on AI. So those are like two areas of legislation that have potential to impact biometrics and identity technologies. There is not a consensus on a national broad approach to AI regulation, and I don't honestly think that will change probably, especially if we're in the same gridlock situation.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask, and I might be wrong about this. I want to know what you guys think. I've kind of observed casually in some of the reporting that we've done that I get the sense there's been a decent amount of executive action on like setting cyber defense priorities and stuff like that. So first of all, like, am I right, or has the Biden administration just been kind of normal in that way? And second, do you expect continuity if it's victory for the Democrats again at the executive level, or do you think if the Republicans win, do you think they'll adopt a similar approach in terms of just prioritizing cybersecurity and using executive orders to mandate things?
Well, I think I definitely you would, yeah, you definitely see executive actions, be more utilized. I think whoever wins, because you're not going to have a consensus on large legislative, items. So probably a continuation for the most part for Harris. And in Trump, there's certain things Trump said that he would do. Obviously, the most of his policy on immigration was based on executive actions that were just switched, whenever Biden came in 2020, 21. And then there's also things like even the Biden's executive order on AI. Trump has said that he would reverse that if he comes in. So what exactly that means for agencies, it's a little hard to tell because they're in the process of implementing that right now. As far as what Harris would do different on the executive action front, Ron, unless you can recall anything, I don't think that's even, we can't even speculate on that yet because there's so little known about what kind of different position she would take compared to the current administration. So
Yeah, agree. So Alex, we have an AI advisory board here at SIA that I work on that includes a lot of leading members of the security industry, and so obviously this stuff is very important to us. And like Jake said, I don't remember seeing Harris come out and say anything in regard to that topic. That would be really indicative of what she might do during an administration.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to.
sorry, it's kind of
Don't you?
I don't want to get too political, but I have observed a lack of clear policy from both candidates across a number of topics. So
that's an accurate observation. Well, and you've also got things that are talked about, but you don't know if they're actually going to materialize. Like for economic policy, I mean, for our industry, something like this proposal on a 10% tariff on all imported items would be disastrous, right? I mean, but I don't think I'm not sure how serious that really is. I mean, and then even if it is, you'd have to get that through, like Congress could potentially block something like that. So,
right. Okay, well, maybe just to try and drag us out of the political weeds here for a sec, just going back to the overall report, we talked about like the big picture from the survey, but what would you say are the implications for the industry that Tony and I cover, which is identity technology and biometrics? Do you have any like obvious takeaways from your survey results?
So we do break it down by sector to a certain degree. One of the questions that we ask respondents is what sector they are in. Unfortunately for this podcast, biometrics specifically is not one of the options. they presumably would classify themselves in the identity management access control
Right.
sector. So I was looking at those numbers before this podcast specifically for that sector, and it looks like they're trending about the same as the overall numbers, generally about 70%, saying things are looking good now. And one other number that I did not mention earlier is overall the entire survey, about 78% when asked how their company will fare in the next 3 months, about 78% said that things will be either a little better or much better. So even a bit higher than they're currently characterizing things. And that number was also similar for the access control and identity management respondents.
Mhm. So just looking again, because you had some data particular to biometrics and the identity tech sector, where would you place that in terms of, I guess, the overall momentum of the security industry? Like, do you see a huge amount of growth in the next few years, or would you say it's sort of like just steady, or are we plateauing in this industry? Like, what's your general sense from the data you've been seeing?
I don't know that we have numbers that would specifically correlate to that question. My sense from what I see in the industry is, yeah, there's certainly growth there, especially with FR and increasing demands there. That's certainly an issue that Jake and his team have done a lot of work on, so you might be able to add something to that. But I feel like the FR and biometrics in general, they're all in that emerging technologies category that really is kind of driving the industry.
I think, Ron, don't we have, isn't there numbers on like the overall growth rate of the industry? Or
Overall, yeah. We did a report a few months ago that projected some good growth for the industry, and as we talk here, I can pull up some of those numbers. But we didn't really have a breakdown there for biometrics.
I can just tell you, like, anecdotally, based on conversations with members, right? I mean, I think that the using biometrics for authentication and access seems to be where a lot of the growth is, happening. And I think there's a greater societal acceptance of this too that goes along with it. I mean, we've got our NFL football season just started, and all of those stadiums have this ability of fans to opt into a system where they can use that, I believe. And it's just one example, but I think we're also seeing it. We're seeing it building access control systems, things like virtual or remote access for even, residential buildings and things like that. I was just recently talking to some members that are active in that space, and it sounds like there's a lot of interest. And of course, it's been a long time in the making. I mean, these technologies have been around for years, but I think people are getting more comfortable with them. Now you can actually do things like use these technologies instead of having keys and things like that. So
yeah, we've definitely written a lot about the fan entry systems over the years, and it's just picking up so much. I know you mentioned, Jake, the NFL definitely there are a few teams and stadiums that have kind of adopted this stuff. I know the Cleveland Browns are pretty big into it, and in the MLB side, they have their MLB fan entry system. I can't remember if that's exactly what it's called, but there's more than a dozen teams, I think, have already kind of signed into that system. And then we're even seeing novel uses of it. Like, we wrote an article a little while ago about which NFL team has the saddest fans based on it was the Atlanta Falcons, but it was based on, I don't remember if it was based on like an in-stadium thing that they did with using facial recognition, but
oh yes, we've seen. So unfortunately, some of the misconceptions continue about biometrics in the media, because people love to write about this and misconstrue things. That was definitely one of them, as an example, that there was people are mixing up the access control, systems that are voluntary based for fans to use versus the there's a fan cam application where you can look and find yourself,
Yeah.
and during a game, it's completely separate, right? But
Yeah.
people working, fighting those things together. So that's just one example.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I mean, to see that technology enter the NFL, enter like the mainstream sports sort of area, I imagine that that's not the last time we'll kind of see people conflating. Like if you go to a Cleveland Browns game and you get in, you don't have to wait in line, and then you can get your beer in 30 seconds. You're benefited from the use of that tech. But then if you read something in the news and you say, "Oh my God, they can spot me in the stands and I can identify myself," like that's not what I thought I was getting myself into. That's where that sort of thing comes from. But we also wrote the other day about uh, the World Cup that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are hosting together in 2026, and just all the various ways that this was specifically about the United States, but the different kinds of biometric tech will be used for security access and fan throughput and all that stuff. But just sort of to get us a little bit back on track, I had a bit more of like a straightforward question, and that's just like, how does SIA actually conduct these surveys? How many people are polled? How do you select them? What's that process like?
Yes, so we target leaders in the security industry, senior executives in the industry, and so we'll send it out to a few hundred. Obviously, we're not going to get everybody to respond every month. Typically, for a given survey, we'll have around 100 responses. So we try to keep it at that level. Obviously, there's some variation in who responds. I know we have some who are very faithful about it, and we appreciate their support every other month. But yeah, we want it to be a picture of the attitudes of senior leaders in the security industry.
I mean, that's probably the way to do it. And
That's what I was going to say.
yeah, and it sounds like you get like a pretty wide span across like the different segments. So not just access control, but like a number of other areas as well. I was curious how I'm not even sure how to ask this. Like security has basically increasingly been going digital for several decades. And so for us, like when I asked earlier, where do you see biometrics and identity tech? Part of that came from this process of digitization. Like we got to move beyond passwords. I know passwords are digital, but moving beyond archaic security mechanisms like in access control, where it used to be lock and key, and now it's you swipe a badge or you do a face scan or something like that. So when you're looking at the big picture of the industry, like percentage wise, how much of it is what you would call cyber security and how much is physical, and how do you see that trending?
Boy, great question. In terms of numbers, boy, I definitely can't give you that. I'm not sure how you would even define it now because there's so much overlap. So historically, SIA was a physical security association, physical security technology. The traditional camera on the wall and maybe card reader at the door. But more and more over the years, certainly since I've been here over the past 16 years, that has changed so much. And so much equipment now is on the network. So now cybersecurity is essential to physical security. And if it's not cyber secure, then you're just adding an endpoint that creates a vulnerability. So, if there were Venn diagrams of physical security and cyber security, they would be moving not, I would say, closer and closer together, but it's more than that. Now they're overlapping more and more. And what those numbers are, I don't know, but I feel safe in saying that they'll continue to overlap more and more. And I expect that. I mean, I don't want to put a year on it, but at some point, I think physical security and cybersecurity it'll be a distinction without a difference. There's just going to be essentially entirely overlapping each other.
Yeah, that's a smart answer. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, one other thing. I mean, so I can only tell you what I know, but the usage of remote online authentication, I guess, I don't know, that seems like that would be it's almost certainly a cybersecurity
Yeah.
rule. It's authentication, but it's because you're online and really cybersecurity, type of application. So that I know the use of that is growing. And one thing that did happen recently, which is that there's a U.S. government has a federal digital identity guideline under NIST, and it's being updated. It's been going on for years. All the really technical folks have been commenting on it. We submitted comments on it last year, but they just released basically a final draft of it, which should be finalized soon because they think they wanted comments by today. There was some worry that they were going to move away from biometrics. They're seeking alternatives to using biometrics, namely facial recognition for remote online authentication at a high level. But they did not. So the final, this version that we saw keeps the central role of biometrics in that process as the guideline, which is basically the standard how the federal government would do this. I know for access to certain accounts for citizens to the government through GSA's program, General Services Administration, I believe they're essentially rolling out facial recognition as part of that. I believe early next year. So, but that to the extent that that's, relates here, I think probably see a lot more of that. And that's also a pretty interesting field. It's always evolving because you're needing to defend against presentation attacks, spoofing, things like that, which now the federal government is actually starting to look at. There's through the Department of Homeland Security, their Biometrics and Identity Center is doing like an evaluation of those technologies, anti-spoofing technologies. So that's becoming more important.
Yeah, definitely. The deepfake thing it almost feels like it came out of nowhere, but we're writing about it constantly on our sites, and actually like that prompted us to do we have a regular AI update feature that we try to publish every week for this reason, just to keep an eye on that space. So yeah, it makes sense. It made sense to me earlier when Ron mentioned that there's an AI focused group as well.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe we can do a whole other conversation about that in the future. That would be interesting. But what can you say about it now, Ron? How it relates to cybersecurity and this kind of space?
Yeah, definitely love to do another discussion about that specifically. But yeah, so the AI advisory board, we started that up last year, and that's really an indication of how SIA has been transforming over the past several years, and how the security industry itself has been transforming in terms of embracing these new technologies. If we do a separate publication than the one I've been talking about, do one every year called Megatrends. And if you looked at it, 10 or 15 years ago, it would be the traditional security technologies. We didn't do it back then, but if it did exist back then, it'd be, IP cameras, things like that. But if you look at it now, for example, the one we did last year, the top 4 megatrends were all related to artificial intelligence. And then, if you look further down the list, it's other stuff related to emerging technologies, and whether it's as a service or cloud or cybersecurity, et cetera. So yeah, the AI advisory board in particular, the goal there is to try to get out in front of this massive issue that is just having such a huge impact, or certainly has the potential to have a huge impact on the industry specifically, and on society in general. And there's certainly a lot of potential there, but at the same time there are some risks too. So the board is trying to kind of get a handle on that, produce some resources, provide some guidance in terms of how AI fits into security solutions, and how it can all be done in a safe, effective, and responsible way.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there. And I'm sure if we were to talk about it for half an hour now, in 6 months, it would be a completely different conversation.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I know we're running low on time, so I just have one more question. How, according to the SIA, should our American listeners vote? I'm just joking. No, I just wanted to know what you guys have coming up. I know you guys have a couple of really big conferences every year, and I just wanted to let you tell our listeners what you have next.
Yeah, so the next big event for us will be ISC East. That's Security Expo and Conference in New York City, November 20th and 21st. We'll also have some events going along with that. November 20th, we have SIA Honors Night, which is our annual awards gala event. And on November 21st, I'll pitch this since it's my event. We're holding a critical infrastructure lunch alongside ISC West. And we'll have a special guest speaker, Walter Alvarado, Vice President from Con Ed, a major utility up there in New York City, will be our guest speaker. So looking forward to that. And yeah, Jake, anything else?
Well, yeah, for mine, this is not, we haven't put this up on the site yet, but we're doing a webinar with NIST on November 12th, which it will be focused on the FRTE and FACE or FATE evaluations. So that's facial recognition and face analysis technologies. So that whole program will receive an update from NIST on that and have an opportunity for back and forth, with folks in the industry, as far as like what they're doing now and also their future plans.
Yeah, that's going to be super important for people to keep track of. I know that program just split not too long ago from what it used to be.
Right. They split. Then I think they added some analysis elements to it. So I know they just put out, I think it was this week, they released some results on age estimation technology. So obviously not authentication or identification, but age estimation. So
still biometrics.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I almost said that it wasn't, but I'm like, that's not right.
Well, it's ID tech, as we like to say here at
Very
ID.
smooth, Alex. Very smooth.
But yeah, this was a really interesting conversation, guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And I really hope we can do this again, because we want to know what trends you guys are tracking, and you are clearly very knowledgeable experts. So please come back, and thank you for talking with us today.
Yeah. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.